And our very first speaker today is Morgan Doran. Morgan is a livestock and natural resource advisor in UC Cooperative Extension. He's been associated with oak conservation issues and the relationship of oaks and livestock for some time. He works in the Sacramento Valley and Coastal Range, covering Solano, Napa, and Yolo counties. And Morgan will talk to us for about the next 30 minutes on livestock and grazing management. So Morgan, it's all yours.
All right, thank you, Rick. And good morning, everyone. Want to thank Rick for the opportunity to present this to you. And I have to say that I think I have more anxiety presenting this way than I do in front of a large crowd of people. It's so if I make any blunders, that's my excuse, and I'm sticking to it. So the intention I have with this presentation is primarily to give you the tools that you need to understand and apply grazing in an oak woodland setting. And I want to start out, I'm going to move through this pretty quickly to get through to the end. And I wanted to start out by just reviewing very quickly a history of livestock grazing, livestock in California rangelands and oaks. And as we all know, that the Spanish colonization had a pretty big impact, an extremely big impact on our rangelands, primarily through the introduction of annual species that transformed our rangelands. And then later in the mid 1800s to latter part of 1800s, we had a series of events that had pretty severe impacts on our rangelands. The California Gold Rush brought a large population influx into California, and the U.S. Civil War was occurring just shortly after that, and both of which created a large demand for livestock products, and consequently had resulted in a pretty severe use of rangelands. And that was followed shortly afterwards by a series of very severe droughts in the 1860s and 1870s. Now, California wasn't alone in experiencing these impacts. It was common throughout the entire western United States. And after seeing these impacts on the rangelands and just the detrimental effects of that, it spawned the discipline of range science in the early 1900s. And that's a discipline that has been evolving ever since then. And it's primarily that's brought more of a focus to manage our rangelands and using science to help us improve the decisions that we're making on rangeland management. And there are two things I wanted to bring to our attention. One, I called war against oaks, and that might be kind of a severe description, but it was a kind of robust campaign that we had in the 1950s, 1960s to get rid of those weedy oak trees in order to grow more grass for livestock. And we had several brochures that were circulated to our clientele with science supporting methods on how to clear those oaks. So, of course, with hindsight, we now know that, and with science, we now know that probably wasn't the best decision. But this created an opportunity to have research projects. When we saw the effects of removing oak trees, we noticed that there was a need for some research behind that, and so and that has taken place, and we now know that it probably was not the best decision. And so a similar series of events was occurring in the just a little bit later in the 1980s, 1990s. You may recall the call for cattle free by '93. It was a pervasive effort to remove livestock from rangelands and other grazing systems in the name of conservation. And once again, that produced an opportunity for more research on rangelands to study the effects of removing livestock. And as a consequence of that, there have been several symposia on this topic. And one in particular I wanted to highlight occurred in 2006. Titled Grazing for Biological Conservation. It was sponsored by the Society for Range Management and Society for Conservation Biology, and it highlighted several benefits that can can be had from grazing. Most of the presenters were describing how grazing has benefited vernal pools or amphibians or bird populations, or how grazing can help control exotic species. And on this next slide, I provide a list of references from that symposium. They're all very, very interesting. I don't have, there's not enough time to cover those right now, but the list is there for you to look at your own time. So a lot of this, these issues of grazing, good grazing, bad grazing, just brings up a question of what is grazing? And frustratingly so, many times people think of grazing as being present or absent, when actually there is a very broad spectrum of grazing applications. So we can't think of it as a black or white situation. We have to understand what kind of grazing is occurring in order to understand the impacts. And in order to communicate the kind of grazing that we are using in various situations, we use grazing parameters to describe and define the type of grazing that is occurring. And so there we go. And so these parameters, we use those to, we manipulate those parameters to achieve specific grazing objectives. And this is really important to have these parameters. It's kind of a standardized method of, or standardized way of communicating the type of grazing that is occurring. And so, so I want to talk a little bit about why we would want to use grazing and manipulate these grazing parameters. Well, one objective that often comes to the top of the list in rangeland management is the use of grazing for income. And that can be either through livestock production, coming from a rancher's perspective, or leases, coming from a landowner's perspective, or perhaps tourism dollars. There might be a lot of vegetation management objectives. Ranchers typically want to maximize forage production. Others may want to manage for a particular set of species, perhaps perennial grasses or some forbs. There might be some weed management objectives, or managing for reduced fire fuels, vegetation management in buffer areas, perhaps around riparian zones, or managing vegetation for wildlife habitat. And an important one I listed last here is residual dry matter. It's often referred to as RDM. And that refers to the amount of vegetation, this is dead vegetation, that remains at the onset of the rainy season. And that dead vegetation is very important because it provides cover to the soil, and so protects the soil during rain events. And it's also important because it determines what the species composition and the amount of forage production will be in that subsequent growing year. I will talk a little bit more about the residual dry matter later on in the presentation, but what we usually shoot for are moderate amounts of residual dry matter. So some other objectives that people may have, there might be some environmental objectives, such as protecting water quality. Some may want to increase the soil organic matter. And I put recreation there mainly because recreation is a broader objective on many rangelands. And when you are combining livestock grazing and people, you can have some hairy situations at times. So the grazing has to be done in a way to accommodate that type of recreation. And Sheila Berry is a livestock advisor down in the Bay Area counties, and she has a tremendous amount of experience on those types of issues and how to manage livestock and recreation together. There might be some other income sources, some forest products, or some other agricultural products that need to be accommodated by the grazing. And others may have an objective to increase the number of trees, whether they're oaks or any other kind of tree species. And that often brings up the question in a rancher's mind, is that if increase the number of trees or the tree canopy, then that will decrease it'll produce shade over the understory and reduce the amount of forage production. And that is true after a certain point. And that was a particular topic that was addressed in a presentation that John Battles and his colleagues presented at the 2006, I think it was 2006 Oak Symposium. And in that, he described the relationship between canopy cover, which is shown right here on the x-axis, and net primary production on the y-axis. And I'm not sure if the numbers are clear, but I want to bring your attention to this dashed line right here, and that is the production of herbaceous matter as tree canopy cover right here increases. And right between 35 and 55% canopy cover is where we have this sweet spot where herbaceous cover or herbaceous vegetation production is maximized. And so we can, in many cases, increase tree cover and perhaps increase forage production in some oak woodland systems. So I want to continue with this question of what grazing is by first describing some of the, very broadly, some grazing systems that we have in California. What is very common on most of our rangelands is a low density grazing situation, which we have cattle spread out over a very broad area, and that's usually associated with a very long duration. Cattle usually brought in the fall, and they come out, they're there throughout the winter and spring months, and then come out in the late spring. And this is referred to as an extensive grazing system. And that is opposed to a high density situation, which is usually associated with a short duration of grazing, and we refer to that as an intensive system. Now, these will produce very different effects, primarily as a result of the livestock grazing behavior. A low density situation will result in very high selectivity by the livestock, meaning that they will take their time and they'll choose the very best parts, the very best areas to consume forage, which results in an uneven utilization of the forage. Whereas in a high density situation, it's a very competitive environment, and so the livestock are going to be rushed to consume the forage before their neighbors do. So their selectivity is very low, which results in a very even utilization. And so that's the first of the grazing parameters that I wanted to cover. And livestock density is the first grazing parameter, and that's defined as the number of animals per acre or hectare, if you prefer those units. But we also describe that as as animal units per acre, and that's actually in range science the preferred method of describing livestock density, animal units, because it is a standardized set of units. One animal unit is equal to the amount of forage that one cow that weighs 1,000 pounds will consume in a day, and that's about 26 pounds of dry matter. Now that does convert to other species of livestock. For example, one animal unit is equal to 5 sheep, or 1 sheep will be equal to 0.2 animal units. And so these equivalencies are converted to other species of livestock as well. So the other grazing parameter is grazing duration, which is defined as the number of hours in very short duration systems, or number of days or number of months. The next grazing parameter is the timing of the grazing. Grazing can occur can be described as occurring in various seasons, which is winter and spring grazing is very common, like I said before, in California rangelands, but we do have some situations in which we do have summer grazing, and those might have some disease, livestock disease considerations for grazing in the summertime, or perhaps it depends on the location in the climate in those particular areas. But we can be more precise in how we define the timing of grazing. If we are grazing in order to control a weed species, for example, like yellow star thistle, then we probably want to apply the specific set of grazing parameters maybe in the bolting stage. For Medusa head, we want to apply a specific set of grazing parameters in the boot stage. And so we have to sometimes be more precise if we have very precise objectives of our grazing. And the type of animal will also have a big impact on the vegetation. Sheep and cattle are classified as grazers, meaning they are going to be less selective in the plants and plant parts that they choose, and compared with goats, which are classified as browsers, which means that they are highly selective in the plant parts that they choose, and also in plants. They can also, as well as deer, they will eat a pretty high content of their diet. A proportion of their diet can be leaves from shrubs and trees. Cattle and sheep do eat leaves from those trees and shrubs, but they cannot tolerate a high proportion in their diet as goats and deer can, as browsers can. So a quick review of the grazing parameters. We have livestock density, grazing duration, timing of grazing, and type of animal, and there are probably more grazing parameters, but these are the big ones. And these are all manipulated to achieve the desired results. And when one speaks about the art of grazing, it really does speak to the ability of someone to mix these grazing parameters, mix and apply these grazing parameters in an adaptive fashion. And just remember that every month is different. We have different conditions, and so the grazing parameters will probably be shifted, and every year is different. So really, good applications of grazing really says a lot about the person who is applying the grazing parameters. It's also important, now that you have an understanding of what grazing is, we can define that. It's important to understand what the impacts of grazing can be. And I want to emphasize this point once again that grazing is not a black and white situation. Different grazing applications will produce very different impacts. It's also important to understand that the same grazing applications in one year will not produce the same impacts in another year, because the conditions might be very different. The weather conditions might cause more or less vegetation. And there's a very useful website I wanted to bring your attention to. We don't have time to link to that website right now, but it is right here. And basically, it is a dynamic tool for you to use to evaluate what the impacts are going to be when you choose specific grazing parameters. So I encourage you all to go to that website, learn how to use it. It does take a little bit of time to learn how to use it, but it is a very useful tool. How do we manipulate grazing? Fencing is probably the most common way, and that can be done with either permanent fencing, steel wire, or it can be done with electric fencing, which is the case in this picture. But that isn't the only way to manipulate grazing. Herding is another method that can be used either by itself or in conjunction with fencing. Herding is not a very common method used here in California, mainly because of labor constraints, but it is used on very large ranches in other parts of the country to shift the impacts from one area to the next. Tractants can be a very useful tool in manipulating the grazing parameters. Livestock watering troughs and the strategic placement of these troughs can be very useful in drawing cattle to perhaps underutilized areas. Of course, if you're going to use it as a bathtub, it may not serve as a very strong attractant for livestock. So be careful what you are attracting to your livestock troughs. And supplements are a very good way to attract livestock. Some supplements are Many supplements are given to livestock in the form of molasses mixed with minerals and protein. And Mel George has done a lot of research, and others have done a lot of research on this topic by placing GPS collars on livestock and then seeing where livestock are moving throughout the ranch. And then they'll put a supplement in one part of the ranch and observe how their grazing behavior changes, how their movements change across the landscape. So some very interesting research coming out of that. Fertilization can be another method, but there are some high costs to that, and perhaps some other consequences that you may not anticipate. It can be, when it is used properly, it can serve as an attractant by increasing the forage quality in some areas. But of course, there are greenhouse gas emissions to consider when you're applying fertilizers, using and applying fertilizers, and it may just not be very practical. Looking at this picture right there, it's a very diverse and broad landscape, and of course, you can't apply fertilizers across an entire landscape like that. So it should be used for only very strategic purposes. So as a livestock advisor, I often get asked about estimating carrying capacity on a ranch or a part of a ranch. And when doing, if I don't have the answer off the top of my head, I often refer to sometimes a soil survey, in which I go to the range site descriptions and look up the amount of dry matter produced per acre, or replacing those range site descriptions is ecological site descriptions. And on that page, I have a link for ecological site descriptions. I'm not going to click it, but it will take you to this page, which is the California Rangelands page. And if you click on this California vegetation link up in the top left-hand corner, it will take you to this page. And down here, you see ecological sites and state and transition models. You click that, and right here is a link to oak woodland and annual grassland ecological site descriptions. And if you click that, you have a whole list of ecological site descriptions for oak woodlands in California. It's a very comprehensive list, and I'm not going to click on this, but these links are links to publications on those various ecological site descriptions. So very useful and very comprehensive information in those publications. So once you have the dry matter production on a per acre basis, you can subtract the residual dry matter, and that gives you the amount of vegetation that's available for livestock utilization. And then with that, you can determine the number of animal unit days or months. It does require a little bit of math, but it's pretty simple math. And perhaps the best way is just to talk to a rancher. Ranchers have really good experience. If they have experience on a particular ranch, they have a very good idea of what that carrying capacity is and what the variability of that carrying capacity is depending on the climatic conditions. So I want to quickly go over just the basic steps of developing a grazing plan. The first step is to assess your resources. Know where your fences are, the condition of the fences, know where your watering sites are located, know what the infrastructure is on the ranch for every field on the ranch. You also need to assess the site conditions. Some fields may have various limitations. Maybe there are specific vegetation conditions, or such as weed populations, or a very high canopy cover that will limit the amount of grazing that could occur. Or maybe slope and various topographical features can limit the grazing. Once you have those assessments done, you can determine the objectives of the various parts of the ranch. Develop your objectives for RDM, which I think is what I have in the next slide. Yes, RDM targets. You might have a whole suite of objectives to consider, but RDM should be one of those principal objectives that you define. And we have a very useful publication called the Guidelines for Residual Dry Matter on Coastal and Foothill Rangelands in California, and I provided a link down here at the bottom. This is a free download, and it basically explains how we determine residual dry matter targets based on precipitation or location, on slope and canopy cover. Also in the grazing plan, you want to define the monitoring program that you'll have. The monitoring can be an annual review of residual dry matter, or it can be photo point monitoring to capture vegetation changes over time. If you want to be more precise in capturing those vegetation changes, you may want to consider some line transects, some permanent line transects. And that way you can capture perhaps shifts in more specific weed populations or shifts from annual to perennial grasses, those types of changes over time. And that can be done perhaps every 2 or 5 years. That is, line transects is more of a long-term type of monitoring program. You also should define mechanisms for implementing adaptive management. And that can be as simple as sitting down with a rancher on an annual basis and figuring, and just maybe doing a windshield survey of the ranch and finding out why some objectives were not met or why they were met, and how the grazing can be changed in a manner that can meet those objectives for the rangeland, but also for the rancher. And I strongly encourage everyone to use the KISS model when developing grazing plans, and that is just keep it simple, stupid. I don't mean that you're stupid. It's just the way that the way that the KISS model comes out. But so I apologize for that. But just keep it really simple. It doesn't have to be an overly complicated document. It can be quite simple. The main thing is to keep it realistic and keep it achievable. And then comes the art of applying the grazing plan. And this is where the rubber meets the road, or the animals meet the grass. And you really do have to work with a rancher in applying a grazing plan. The lease agreement can be used as a tool. It can be viewed as more than just an arrangement for collecting rent on a piece of land. It can be used as a tool if objectives are built into the lease. These are the objectives we want to meet, and they are conditions of a lease. And land tenure, which is also part of the lease agreement, has a very, very big impact on the applications of the grazing plan or the ability of someone to meet objectives. When we look at a short versus a long-term lease, those can have very big implications. In a short-term lease situation, there's very little incentive for a rancher to invest in long-term benefits and long-term objectives. It also should be flexible. Agreements should be flexible so that it can accommodate perhaps changes in weather, perhaps some changes in production, livestock production objectives. But just maintain flexibility. Don't produce a lease agreement that's going to be too rigid. And the next bullet there is just be very cautious with constraints. Ranchers will be very, very skeptical if there are too many constraints because it limits their ability to meet their objectives, and it may backfire if there are some vegetation objectives that can't be met in certain conditions. For example, if you have a very wet year and you want to control Medusa head, if the cattle are supposed to come off early because that's what the lease says, well, that may conflict with a Medusa head control grazing objective. And be willing to accommodate extraordinary circumstances. If there are very precise objectives that require a lot of work on the rancher's part, then that's going to come at a cost. And you might want to think about and negotiate with a rancher what those costs are going to be, and perhaps how the lease can accommodate those. Perhaps a reduction in lease payments and rental payments. Just be very cautious of flexibility, maintaining flexibility. So I just want to close with this list of publications that I encourage you to look at. One is an ANR Rangeland Management series of publications. There's a web link right there. These are free downloads. There are some very useful rangeland monitoring manuals provided by the USDA. These are free downloads as well. And a residual dry matter photo guide, which does come at a cost, but it is a very useful guide that allows you to train your eye to amounts of residual dry matter on the rangeland so that you can just go out and quickly do a windshield survey and understand what's going on out there. So with that, I'll close and hand it over back to Rick.
We got the 4 questions about the livestock issues that we'll get to hopefully in the question and answer period. One of them did deal with water quality, and our third speaker today will talk a lot about grazing and water quality issues. So we have those questions cataloged, and we'll get to them. Our next speaker is Bill